Welcome to CS Education Zoo, episode number 11. I'm your guest host, Paim Kiarostami, and here to introduce our guest is Steve Wolfman.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this zoo. Our guest today is Warren Coe. Warren is the Associate Director for the University of British Columbia Faculty of Science Center for Learning and Teaching. Unlike most of our guests, Warren is not a computer scientist. His background and his PhD are in mathematics, but Warren administers the Carl Wyman Science Education Initiative at UBC, where he works to education through a huge variety of initiatives across many disciplines, including CS. He also has a personal connection to CS as a proponent of software carpentry, which I hope we'll get a chance to talk more about soon. So without further ado, Warren, welcome to the zoo.
Hi, Steve. Hi, Paim. Great to be here.
Awesome. I wanted to start out just asking you to tell us a little bit about your career trajectory and how you ended up in science education.
Sure, thanks. So my PhD was in mathematics, as you said, at UBC here in the math department. And it was kind of during that time I got to do quite a bit of teaching and some really interesting TA-ships. And I'd always been interested in teaching, and at that point got more interested in issues around teaching, like can we teach better, or are things actually working, or that sort of thing. And trying to explore that a bit more. So I would take workshops from what's now our Center for Teaching and Learning Technology, that sort of thing, trying to get better, trying to know more, and eventually starting to learn a little bit more about the research literature in education, which was not any part of my earlier training. And then as I was finishing up, the Carl Wyman Science Education Initiative had already begun, and they were looking for new people in the math department. The model for the initiative is to have faculty partnered with people from their own discipline kind of embedded in their department, and we call those folks Science Teaching and Learning Fellows, STLF.
So you're like embedded journalists then?
That's the idea, yeah. Yeah, you're like right there. Yeah, so that's the idea, is that it's people that, so I studied math, I was based in the math department, I had done some teaching in math, I had a graduate degree in math. That was a pretty typical background for our fellows in their various disciplines in their departments. And so then I came on as a postdoc kind of in that role. So our fellows, it's sort of a more junior role. There's a lot of learning expected, learning about learning, basically learning about how people learn things and what kind of teaching methods seem to promote better learning, and those sorts of things. And then it's becoming kind of an expert within the department on those issues, particularly in that discipline, and working with faculty around changing courses. We call these course transformations as sort of one of the main activities, which is really working through a course, trying to determine, what's the point, what are the kind of major goals here, and then how is it best to address them. So that was kind of so this came up. The initiative didn't exist when I started grad school, and then by the time I finished, and it wasn't like outrageously long, but it was long enough, there was this initiative, and it was a pretty exciting chance for me, because it was really headed the way I was headed with things. I felt like I could make a better contribution on kind of the teaching side of things. So I was there for 3 years in that role, and then an opportunity came up more centrally. So I'm now based in the Dean's office with our Science Center for Learning and Teaching, which has since kind of taken over administration of the initiative, and then also works with the various science departments on other initiatives that are going on at UBC. And so that's been more of a central role, and now I work with the STLFs, those Science Teaching and Learning Fellows from all the departments, and trying to coordinate them on, giving them advice on projects, whether that's kind of their research investigations, or how do we transform a course in a certain way, and also working with them on their professional development. So we kind of have an ongoing series around trying to build skills and learn more what's current in the literature, and give people an opportunity to get feedback on their own writing and that sort of thing.
So I'm familiar with the Science Teaching and Learning Fellow model because I'm at UBC, but I'm thinking about people who are at other institutions who won't have Science Teaching and Learning Fellows in place necessarily, and I'm wondering if there's something from the process here at UBC that those people at other institutions can learn about how to improve as educators in their own discipline.
Sure. Yeah. So we've actually seen a number of other institutions have adopted the model in some form. So the basic idea is, as I said, bringing somebody from the discipline so they're in touch with kind of disciplinary issues around learning. So how do people learn math, or where do students really traditionally kind of have trouble when they struggle with mathematics at the university level, and bringing them up to speed on how people learn effectively. And it's really about having somebody that's got kind of that dedicated time. I mean, is really what it boils down to, is having somebody with that time to be able to learn all that stuff and be able to bring it to the department and be there kind of right there down the hall from faculty as they're trying to do things. Faculty are certainly capable of doing all of these things, well, in principle, but there's generally just not the time for them to develop kind of along these lines. So it's really to give them kind of a partner in this, and to kind of speed it up for them, so they have this, someone who's right there to work with. As I said, we've hired them as postdocs or contract faculty. Let's see, they work with a few faculty at a time, usually not too many, because it's a pretty substantial amount of work. Finding out what's known about learning in this particular course, learning about different kinds of teaching methods, learning about how to investigate properly and what kind of tools are available to measure student learning, those sorts of things. And then there's also, when it comes to measuring student learning, which is an important part of the initiative, which is, we want things to be based on evidence, and we want to collect local evidence, which is particularly convincing for people. We do, that also is a substantial time investment. I mean, it's something that it would be difficult for faculty to participate in to the same extent. It's sort of scholarship of teaching and learning projects are now kind of become much more popular for faculty to undertake, but our science teaching and learning fellows can spend more time on that kind of research project. They can do things that faculty either wouldn't be able to do because of time, but they can also do things that wouldn't be feasible, maybe ethically, for faculty, in terms of studying their own students. Having kind of a third party who's not actually the instructor, you can kind of get at different things from students. So there's kind of these different advantages, and we found it's been quite successful, we would say. We've had just over 50 people in this role over the years, with a peak of about 22 or something like that a few years ago.
Wow.
Departments. Yeah.
I didn't realize it was so big.
So, yeah, it's accumulated. So the initiative started in 2006 was when UBC committed the money, and the idea was that departments proposed against this large amount of money to say what they wanted to do, and then the money started coming in 2007. So they started hiring these science teaching and learning fellows in 2007. So it's now been, it was proposed as a 5-year initiative. So we're now in the 8th year, I think. Some of the departments did finish up, and we'll have a couple more years. So I think it's going to be 10 years kind of total. But it's because there's different startup times in different departments, and it's kind of an unusual role. So hiring people and knowing what to do with them, there was a lot of learning to do there. So I think that's part of what stretched it out. But there's certainly departments that kind of spent all their money and have finished up, and they're on to different kinds of things now too. So, yeah. Oh.
I think Byam wants to ask a question.
Yeah,
I was just unmuting. Sorry about that. I have a very simple question for you. I can tell that you care a lot about teaching. I'm just curious why.
Why? So let's see. So I was always interested in working with people. I mean, when I think back to kind of high school, I was, always interested in how are other people approaching things and tutoring people. So I'd kind of been involved with tutoring for kind of a long time, even before more kind of, formal classroom arrangements or TA-ships. So it's just something that always appealed to me, seeing people get it, seeing people. So in my context, it's math, mostly like high school or university math, but where they kind of get to some level of success that maybe they didn't expect or they weren't sure, like that sense of accomplishment, and being able to foster that, being able to help them along the way. I always really got a kick out of that. So, and then I've been in some ways just kind of doing it at bigger and bigger scale maybe. So I was tutoring one-on-one, and then I was TAing smaller groups, and then teaching kind of large groups, and now I'm it's kind of I won't say like second order teaching what we do with our science teaching and learning fellows, because it's sort of they're working with the faculty who are doing the teaching, and now I'm actually another step removed, working with the people teaching. But
So that's kind of neat. What scale of that did you like the most? Was it the one-on-one? Was it working with teachers? Was it at the administrative level?
I think all of it's been great. I think that definitely the direct contact with students is essential. So I feel like anything that I'm doing now has really been grounded in my own teaching practice. So my own opportunities to work with students. There's definitely a shift going from, say, the tutoring situation to kind of a full class of people. Being kind of responsible for the learning of like 100 people or 200 people is definitely a shift in thinking about. Well, one, you don't. It's just a much more diverse group of people, so you have to concern yourself more with different ranges of people's preparation and different circumstances that people have during the term. So it's a very different kind of thing. But I found that was a great spot. So my own teaching was very important to my further work.
Great. Back to you, Steve.
Okay, I wanted to shift gears for a moment because before we started the interview, you'd mentioned you were interested in software carpentry, and I realized I kind of heard of that term, and I went online and did a little searching, and it was a lot more than I expected. So I was hoping you could tell us a bit about software carpentry and maybe a bit about what you've done with that project.
Sure. So So software carpentry. It's a workshop essentially at its core. It's a workshop that's offered in scientific computing for scientists. I took this workshop a few years ago when it was at UBC. It came through. Basically, the way things were organized is originally it was like one person, Greg Wilson, who's amazing. He was the one who kind of had worked at building up the workshop, and he would show up at a university with a local team, so a couple people that were also interested in teaching about scientific computing practices, and then it would generally be pitched at grad students and postdocs, usually that level, sometimes faculty as well. The overarching kind of mission or purpose is that a lot of people, especially now, who are scientists, early career or not, there's just a lot more data to deal with. There's a lot more programming. People, when they show up in labs in a lot of settings now, there's a lot of code that's involved in doing analysis, and unfortunately, these people often will have essentially zero training in like software development practices. So the software carpentry is intended as like a crash course in like software development kind of workflows. So looking at what can you do with the Unix shell, typically, and then Python, or more recently, there's an R flavor for people that are more doing that kind of analysis. But this would be Python or R, sort of a crash course in like how to write programs defensively, and ideally looking at testing if they get to that. It's only a 2-day workshop, and then version control as a kind of essential means of coordinating things and doing a favor to your future self and your collaborators by just being more careful around considering what's been written and collaborating effectively. So it's meant to save people time, essentially, and future headaches and other kinds of problems that happen when code kind of runs amok. So that's kind of the purpose. So again, people don't get this kind of training, so it was kind of a gap. It started a while ago. I think it started in the 90s, and it's really built up momentum in these last few years. So when I took the workshop, which was only, now I can't remember, 3 or 4 years ago, Greg Wilson, so he was the founder, he was still traveling around and kind of doing all of them. He had a few people that he worked with as instructors, but generally speaking, he was doing all of the workshops himself. And then it just sort of exploded in popularity because there's a huge demand for this across science, and now even in other places like social science, so librarians, for example. Now there's a lot more kind of computation involved. And social sciences, people dealing with data on kind of a different scale than previously done. So that's all done through programming. So now it's to the point where in the last year, I'm not sure which 12-month period exactly, but they're up to 200 workshops offered, and now they're offered. It's across North America. It's in other countries as well. So it's really grown. And then obviously when it's grown that much, Greg isn't going around offering all these workshops anymore, so he had to get into the business of training instructors to be able to do this. And that's kind of where I came in. So I'd kind of, followed the trajectory of software carpentry and was a fan, but wasn't necessarily getting super involved because that's not quite, it's a little digression from what I've been working on in terms of scientific computing. But Greg started training people online, and then last year started training people in kind of in-person workshops. So I worked with him to develop something for an 2 to 3 day in-person workshop. So this is like a crash course in teaching software carpentry, trying to bring in ideas around how people learn things effectively. So some of the same stuff we talk about here in our initiative, because Greg's very big on evidence-based practices. So so that was kind of an interesting partnership to do these kind of crash courses in teaching. And then he's more recently said that maybe the biggest contribution of this whole endeavor will be this like teacher training, because it's also become popular because so again, it's grad students and postdocs, people that are essentially the target audience for the software carpentry scientific computing workshop. A lot of them are interested in teaching because they also tend not to have any teaching training, and they're interested in academic careers, and so they've really flocked to this as well as an opportunity to learn more about teaching. So we go over some of the really key elements of the workshop in terms of teaching, are trying to get feedback from students, making sure that you get information from them. So asking them at some point, what's working and what's not working for you over the course of the workshop. There's the sticky notes are a very popular, very well used within software carpentry. So participants are given at least 2 colors of sticky notes, and then this is an opportunity for them to give sort of like voting information or something to the instructor. So they, pretty much everyone has a laptop, so it's sort of, as you're working through this little exercise, put up a green sticky if you're okay, or put up a red sticky if you need someone to come around, and then they have helpers in the room. So the sticky method is another big part of it. And then there's also a big commitment to live coding. So the idea is the instructors demonstrate principles or methods through projected them doing the coding live, as opposed to kind of a canned presentation. And so that's meant to kind of model their expertise more authentically. They make mistakes, they have to correct them, so that's really effective for participants to see, this is someone who's like me and they're doing it. Or if they run into problems, it's like, oh, well, what I would do here is I would look this up and show you kind of, this is how I would Google this problem, sort of thing. So it's really about making their practice visible for people that aren't as comfortable, and so they get getting a lot of new ideas. So so those are kind of the main teaching methods used in the workshop. So there's a lot of good practices going on there.
I love the stickies. That's
yeah.
I'll remember that.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I said I'll remember that for my class next term, where everybody's got a laptop, just bringing a bunch of red and green stickies.
Yeah. Yep.
I just wanted to go back over, you mentioned sort of a few key elements you try and communicate to people. I guess key skills or competencies who are scientists who need to use computation. And I think you said Unix, sort of for maybe shell management of file system, I imagine. Some sort of flexible data-oriented programming language like R or Python, testing and version control. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, the testing, they've had trouble keeping it, partly because testing data, like testing that data is in the right form, is actually a much harder kind of problem-specific issue. So kind of testing on the software is okay, but like testing that analysis is working is actually quite a hard problem that they're still trying to solve. But that one is up. But certainly, yeah, version control, some kind of, as I said, Python or R, with some ideas around how to program effectively, like writing little bite-sized functions, sort of defensive coding practices, if you like. Yeah, and then, did I say that? Yeah, and then Unix shell as well for some of the kind of basic tools there. Um, yeah. There's some notion of getting your data into a more usable form. So sometimes there's also an introduction to like basic database use, usually like an SQLite. Is that right? Yeah. I don't know how you pronounce that one.
I have no idea. I know how you spell it. Okay, so I guess I'll change gears again, unless Pime, do you have follow-ups? Or?
Nope, no follow-up. I can change gears too if you like.
Oh, go for it. I've been talking a lot.
Great. I wanted to go back to your experiences teaching students now that you work with educators, and I'm really curious what sort of mistakes you see both groups making, and what sort of stuff you see that's unique to them.
All right, great question. I might not frame it in terms of mistakes, just I'll say it. I probably try to put a more positive spin on things. I know from my own, when I started teaching, and this is true of most people in the university setting, how did I learn about what to do? A lot of it was based on my own previous experience. So I was I spent a lot of preparation time to make kind of clear explanations. I felt like kind of that was kind of critical, making sure that I provided the right kinds of examples. I had an idea that students practicing doing things was important, but I was happy to kind of defer that to homework. And so I would, typically lecture. I was happy to take questions from students, but I was teaching, first year math, not a lot of questions happen. You try to ask questions, but it's not like you get a lot of participation. It's usually the same few people. Once you're up to like 100 people, you got kind of the same few people that are comfortable participating. But the thing was, to me, that was what teaching looked like at the university, and I think that's true for most folks. What I learned later on through kind of workshops and participating in this initiative around kind of more effective teaching methods is you can make a lot more, I think, effective decisions around teaching just knowing more about what does learning look like for students. So knowing that this notion of we use the term expertise-based classroom. So the term student-centered learning refers to having a classroom where it's really more, it's not so much about what's done kind of to the students, it's more are they learning, and what's promoting their learning, which is kind of just a different way of looking at it. We talk a bit about the expertise-centered classroom, which is about we think of students as novices in the discipline in some respect, and we're trying to move them along a path towards expertise, because there's a lot of research around kind of the novice to expert path, and you may have heard about the sort of the very ultra sort of simplistic version of this is talking about that like 10,000 hours to become an expert, kind of mastery, but kind of looking at the research around mastery and getting better at things, this notion of deliberate practice. So it's you can become much better at anything essentially with practice, with sensible, appropriate, timely feedback, whatever that means. So that means lots of things in different contexts, but it's this basic idea of practice with appropriate feedback. And if you're comfortable with this as like, oh, this is how people really should be doing things when we're talking about teaching and learning, then what should my classroom look like to support that? So then at that point, I started in my own teaching introducing many more kind of activities in the classroom, so more students getting practice while I'm there to give feedback to kind of, groups that are working as I'm kind of circulating, and then also if there's sort of some pattern emerging with very, different groups, being able to kind of address that as a class, but really making the practice more effective, making the most of that time when we're all together in a room. And then if they had to learn something that they could maybe learn by reading, trying to kind of push that out of the classroom. So that's a pretty common scheme that we've seen with our course transformations is, introduce some kind of pre-reading so that students can still see a lot of the same content or even all the same content, and then make the face-to-face time really productive in terms of this practice with feedback. So that's, yeah, but that's not obvious, I guess, if you're not used to I haven't seen examples.
Is that what's called flipping the classroom?
Basically, yes. So I don't know what's the nice way to say this. We were doing this before the flipping the classroom term became popular. In the last few years, that's certainly become a term that people have used. They typically are talking more about video delivery of that content prior to class for some reason. So I'm not sure why that caught on exactly. I can say we haven't. There isn't really great evidence that videos are necessarily more effective than reading. It's really about, in what way are students engaged with that material prior to class. So it can't just be, just watch this video or just read this chapter or something. So we've got some folks who did work on, study around pre-reading and to what extent can you make it, well, more effective basically means students do it and then maybe you have a little quiz or something for them, but at least they're doing it. And a way to promote that was having very kind of targeted, so a very specific set of tasks, like, make sure you look at this figure and then read this, these specific paragraphs, and then there's sort of a little quiz that basically guides people as to what we hoped you got out of the reading. And then usually some kind of outlet as well of, what questions do you still have or what do you still not understand in this reading? So that's something that the instructor can look at before class and get a sense of like how prepared people are, where the real confusion is in this preparatory material. So that there's ways of making it effective. And then with the idea of students have prepared, they've learned some of the information, they have some of the background knowledge that's essential, even if it was new to them, they've got some of it coming into class, and then you can actually do interesting things with it, rather than having that be their first view of this material. So that's where that's the flipping, yeah.
Very, very neat. You mentioned something called deliberate practice.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
So deliberate practice is something that you'll find in this literature around expertise and experts, how people become experts. A lot of the older research is around chess players, is an example. So people getting better at chess and looking at what effective practices do people use to get better. How do we distinguish people who've become very expert versus people who are just sort of regular players? But deliberate practice as opposed to practice it's the difference between playing a lot of chess games for the same amount of time as playing some chess games, but also reading about kind of theory of chess or practicing opening specifically and looking at different aspects of the game. So it's that kind of, and that's much, and it would also be like playing games, but then reviewing what you did. What were your choices? What would you do next time? So that kind of reflection piece. So that's the deliberate part. So so that's the difference between deliberate practice and practice, where you still get better, but it's not quite as efficient, basically, if you're going to spend the same amount of time. And this is true in, lots of other domains that, people are familiar with. And, athletics, so, high-performing athletes, there's, you take video recordings of performances and go back through that tape and see, what happened, what can be done next, isolating certain skills. It's not just, playing whatever sport over and over. There's all these like deliberate pieces around it to get better.
And so what do you bring to the students? Do you try to bring them the motivation to do that, or do you use the classroom to make sure it happens?
Oh, good question. The motivation piece is essential. We found people, if you just try to kind of throw this new way of doing things at students, there can be a lot of resistance. Because it can be a pretty unfamiliar way of learning for them, a pretty unfamiliar classroom experience. So we do stress that, at the very beginning of term, trying to set expectations, and not just right at the very beginning saying it, but also kind of showing through the term, like this is reminding students of why this is the reason that we're doing this, is because it's your opportunity to practice while we're here, and you can make mistakes and learn what's going on because you're trying to prepare for a test or whatever. So that framing and in trying to motivate students is pretty critical, because otherwise, if they get kind of just mad about it, then they're not necessarily going to participate, even if they're there, but they can kind of go through the motions. So they have to believe that this is effective too. So you do want to try to promote that. But in terms of giving effective feedback, I guess is why it's useful to do some of this stuff in the classroom, is because the instructor is the expert and is able to offer that feedback based on what they know about student learning or about the topic. So we found in a lot of cases, people are concerned sometimes with these activities that it's sort of like, well, I'm going to show up, I'm going to give the students something to do, and then I just kind of sit there and I'm just sort of, now I'm a passive person in my own classroom. The kind of teaching that we promote is actually really the other direction. It's actually much more engaging for the instructor, potentially because students are coming more prepared to class. They're engaging with more interesting questions during class, and they're asking more interesting questions during class. So actually the expertise of the instructor is even more prominent in this kind of setting. But it's trying to draw on that when everybody's together, rather than, well, what are the other ways people might get feedback? So after the fact, if students do homework and then they get some grading and now you're, weeks down the road or whatever, it's not really going to be as helpful for them in getting better because, of course, they've got all the stuff piled on. So
That's really neat. Thank you. Steve, back to you.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on one thing. There were a ton of really interesting things in there, but one thing that I've struggled with thinking about learning to be experts, and the chess research that you mentioned is often drawing comparisons between novice and expert, is what we do for the people who are going to be in the middle. So when we're teaching what a friend of mine likes to call CS Omega instead of CS0 or CS1, the last CS course someone is ever going to take, the students are not necessarily trying to be experts. Do we still want to guide them towards expertise, or is there another goal we should be thinking about?
That's a great question. I think so. This is, I don't know, is this closer to just my opinion? I don't know. I think we would still say it's you think of it as a path towards expertise. So acknowledging that, yeah, people taking your CS Omega are not necessarily going to go into graduate school and become computer scientists. I think there's maybe, I don't know if you're as worried that maybe, you might catch a few from this sort of experience. That's not really the point of it. It's that you want them to get further along the lines of thinking like a computer scientist about problems. I mean, there's some reason that they're taking this course, I assume, based, the whole bundle of things that they could take related to computer science or other courses that they could take. So there's still something in there where, experts are going to be sort of more effective or more knowledgeable about that subject area. Maybe we should take an example of, I don't know, like an intro programming course or an intro course.
Sure.
I don't know, something.
Or calc, if you'd like, definitely.
Yeah. Oh, now we have to talk about intro math. Oh dear. Well, there's still, there's still things to look for in the course that are about, why do people learn this material? What does it mean to think about it like a mathematician? What is it that mathematicians do? It doesn't mean that these people are undertaking research necessarily, though there is a pretty big trend about having students engage with research earlier on if they are in a major program. But it is, what is the essence of this? What are the goals of this for students in terms of learning about mathematics? So you can still look for clues in the direction of what is it that experts do with this kind of material, or what kind of thinking is undertaken when you work in this area. Even things like kind of reasoning logically, or thinking about the notion of like necessary or sufficient conditions for things. Sort of that's not really, well, it's not calculus specific, but it could be part of that calculus or math Omega course. If it's kind of their terminal course, this is kind of mathematical thinking that you think would be beneficial for people, regardless of how much they use any specific calculus content afterwards. So, and that's along the lines of how experts think about things. That answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. So, I mean, it sounds like you're basically saying we still want to think about what experts think about on these topics, but we want to make sure that we scope it according to what students are actually going to want or need to learn from the course, I guess.
Yeah. It could also be thinking about, or thinking of who an expert is slightly differently. So if you're thinking about preparing scientists in terms of their mathematical background, that could include engaging with the scientist experts and how do they use math and kind of what's critical there. So so maybe you get ideas from that kind of broader group, if you like.
Am I hearing that this is more interdisciplinary?
Well, I think when you're talking about what we call service courses, typically, which is not always maybe the nicest term, but if you're thinking about preparing students to be engineers, there's definitely room to talk to engineers, practicing engineers, about what is it that, how is mathematics incorporated into your practice and what kinds of thinking, I don't know if it's a subset necessarily of kind of mathematical thinking is used in engineering, for example, because I think that's a very productive kind of discussion, and it happens to a greater or lesser extent, here on different campuses, how closely if people from different departments talk to the other departments whose students they're teaching. Yeah, I know that here, for example, the math department spent a fair bit of time with the business school talking about, because the business students take some intro calculus courses, so asking about like what kinds of what parts of the material are more relevant, what kinds of analysis is done, even like what kind of variables. So they're using a lot of price and quantity, so it's P's and Q's instead of in a more science direction you'd be using X's and Y's, that kind of thing. So even that kind of thing can matter to students, especially if this is, their math is headed in their learning of mathematics is headed in a certain direction. So it's some of the same reasoning. You get some more familiar objects from the discipline that they are studying, and you learn that by talking to people in the business school in this case.
I may be unusually blockheaded, but that was just the idea that the experts are not necessarily computer science experts, which seems so obvious in retrospect. Seems like a good one to think about.
Yeah, well, and you want both voices, right? If we're talking about this notion of a service course, I mean, the thing is, for most courses, these are preparatory for becoming computer scientists. So then maybe there isn't as much of that conversation, and I think there's always going to be a role for the computer scientists, even in the intro courses, to say, this is why these things matter, and this is why we have this particular content here. But those kind of broader conversations across, I mean, it makes it better kind of for everybody, right? I think nobody wants students feeling like, well, I'm only taking this because it's required. It has nothing to do with my degree. I'm over here with this department, and they have no idea what they're doing. I'm glad I'm going to get this out of the way, and then I can do what I really care about. I mean, I don't think anybody on either, the faculty on either side of that situation are not. They don't necessarily aren't interested in that happening either.
Okay, so I'm going to shift gears again, but maybe back to interdisciplinarity. I wanted to ask you about administering the Science Education Initiative. You've gotten a chance to look at projects and efforts in lots and lots of different disciplines, and presumably at lots of scales and addressing lots of problems. I'm wondering if you could tell us about one or two of your just personal favorite projects that you've been in contact with.
Let's see. I mean, it's partly because I like so many things that people do.
I don't want you to have to pick your favorite children here. So not to suggest that any others aren't also your favorites.
Right. Let's see. They've done some pretty interesting things in sorry, I've got this big jumble of just thinking of all these different exciting things. What's the kind of... So one trend that I like working across the departments, and maybe this isn't quite getting at your question, because I think maybe you're looking at specific projects, but it's just seeing the development of our science teaching and learning fellows. So they come in with, as I said, very little experience, typically in kind of with education research, a little bit of teaching experience, and to see those people really kind of develop and get stuck in with projects and get some really interesting changes in what happens in the classroom, and what faculty who work with them in terms of what they come to value and what they're able to accomplish as well. I mean, ultimately, it's not just about the fellows; it's about everybody in the department. So, what are some favorites that I've seen? There was really just any of these really active, huge classrooms. If we look so I think of like Brett Gilly and Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, and his big class of he's teaching like 300 students, getting them all to do some really interesting activities with simulating, so that students get little props to do their own little simulations, and it can be really simple things. Like one involves marshmallows and pasta sticks, like sticks of spaghetti, and getting them to kind of wave these around to show different kind of structural properties. So something where everybody can do it. It works in a huge classroom, and just how it illustrates the concept. Students really kind of get into it. What's another one? Actually, so one of the really exciting things that's caught on here in the last couple of years is the two-stage exams. And by this, we generally mean two-stage, meaning students write kind of a traditional individual exam, so written exam, midterm or a final exam, for maybe 2/3 of the exam period of that time in the classroom. And then the remaining time, students form groups and redo the same test or a slight variation on some of it, or a subset of harder questions or something like that, but they redo the exam as a group. And the idea there is to take advantage of this, this tendency of students as they kind of filter out of a traditional exam is like, oh, well, what did you get for question 5? Oh, I can't believe you, sort of thing. Like there's sort of there's some nervous excitement, I guess, about, how things went, and probably some disappointment when they find out that it didn't go so well. But it's a kind of harnessing that energy and giving, kind of an outlet, but also taking advantage of, when students are essentially the most prepared for accomplishing something with this material, because they've prepared for the test. They've now written the test and done some thinking of their own. And then it's a great learning opportunity for them to kind of get that feedback immediately from peers, and to kind of to work through this test. And then students will often leave the exam room happy, which is not something that we're necessarily familiar with all the time if you've been to any final exams. So that's become quite popular in science here, but also other disciplines. So I think in science we talk about like 30 or 40 courses have tried doing these kinds of exams now. So that's one that's become very popular, and which is really interesting. Just a great use of time, and turning what's often like a terrible experience for everyone in some ways into something actually like a great learning experience, and much more kind of exciting. Yeah.
I don't have a question, but I think that's really cool.
I did have a question, and now I've scattered. Hold on a sec. So one thing is for our audience, I wonder if we could just say a few more details about how you do a two-stage exam. So how do the grades work on the two-stage exam?
Oh, good point. Yes. Oh, yeah. So there's some favorite questions. Let's see. So typically it's a much smaller percentage of the grade, so it's not like a 2/3, 1/3 like the time. It's typically like 10 to 15% of the grade will be of the group portion will be that'll be the group's portion contribution to the grade. So like 85% on their individual work, and 15% on their group work for the exam. And then usually with the additional condition that if they score higher than their group, then they can just keep their individual grades, so they're not necessarily harmed by participating with their group. It's actually very rare that this ends up being triggered. So generally speaking, the groups do better than the students. So there's been some studies around looking at those kinds of factors, and how much do groups improve, or if you look at the individual groups and or individuals who form a group where maybe they didn't have much of an idea to, how often did they get the right answer and that sort of thing. So there's all kinds of interesting things to read there. The logistics, so it can be done in quite large classes. It's even been done in like 50-minute blocks, which is our, that's your UBC hour anyway, is 50 minutes. People will run midterms in that, and it's, getting everybody sorted out with the individual portion and a few minutes transition time, and then and students are highly motivated to actually get back to work. So I mean, they will participate in getting things organized. We do recommend usually try to do it more than once. So not necessarily just for the final exam, but try to run maybe the midterms that way, or trying to you want it to be not necessarily just one experience for them, because there is a little bit of them just getting used to the process. Did that cover most of the common questions? So there's often a question about students that require extra time through the sort of Access and Diversity Office will often manage these, and students will maybe go to write in a separate setting. So that's a very common question that comes up around this, is what to do with students that are meant to be writing somewhere else. There basically comes down to kind of different strategies that are amenable to both the student and the instructor, like writing in the other center and then coming over and doing the group portion, or having some other kind of accommodation like that. So there have been different strategies to help accommodate students that need it as well. So it's worked pretty well. They've done it in groups or rooms of 900 plus for final exams, this sort of thing. So yeah, awesome. There's some resources on the website. I guess I didn't mention our website yet. So it's cwsei.ubc.ca. We have lots of information about the Wyman Initiative, and there's a resources section with resources for instructors, where we've tried to provide all kinds of, for all these different kinds of things, like different kinds of classroom activities or two-stage exams or the targeted pre-readings. We have a variety of these, we call them little two-pagers. So it's it's a synthesis of the existing kind of literature and some practices that we think have been effective in a little two-page format, so that it's quite digestible, and then you've got references to go look if you want to learn more. We also have some videos on there for examples of, you want to see what a two-stage exam in a big class looks like. There's a video clip of that, so there's quite a bit there to learn more.
Excellent. That's great, and we post shout-outs along with the video, so we'll have that on our website, thanks to the things you've mentioned. Okay, so I caught track of the question that I had earlier. You mentioned one of the things you really like to see is the development of the science teaching and learning fellows that you work with, from when they first start in on this to when they become much more expert at facilitating educators' work. So I'm wondering if practicing educators in our audience could learn from the process that you see. Like, are there key milestones in STLF's development in terms of tools, beliefs, ideas, practices that practicing educators could think about or work on achieving themselves?
Sure, great question. I think probably the big thing that essentially anyone can start with is this getting a background in what evidence exists around kind of teaching and learning, effectively. So we have a startup series, which is basically a reading seminar for these fellows, where actually we also have had faculty participate in the past, so faculty that are interested, or new faculty, or that sort of thing. So a reading series around, how do people learn? What do we know from cognitive psychology research, from other kinds of classroom research, educational psychology, so these different kind of flavors of around learning, and what do we know from there. Our main kind of textbook for this now is a book called How Learning Works, which we'll make sure to include reference. And that we found has replaced some kind of a few different books that were previously used. So previously there was a book called How People Learn, which was published around 2000. I think they're updating it. That one's nice because it's available free online. You can download it's the National Academies Press, I think is the right one. And it's really a foundational text around, this is what has been learned about how people learn effectively. There's stuff about this novice, expert kind of pathway and deliberate practice, and these elements are all in there. But this newer book, the How Learning Works, really has a focus on applications in higher education classrooms. There's little sample scenarios around the different topics. The topics are things like prior knowledge. So your students come into your classroom with a certain amount of prior knowledge. What does their background look like? How can you probe that? How can you work with them to review, these sorts of things. And there's different chapters. There's one on motivation. So, how, students come in with different kind of amount of motivation. How can you promote that in your classroom? How can you, hopefully keep students motivated, get them more motivated, or at least not kind of destroy their motivation to participate, these sorts of issues. So it's very practical focus. So there's sort of, theory, very nice little summary of the literature, and then strategies, for your own classroom in there. So people really tend to like this book, How Learning Works. So we have our reading series on that. And then from there, it can go in some different directions around, if you're more interested in reading further, of course, there's lots of references to follow up. So we have some kind of favorite ones as well. But it kind of depends on what direction you want to go. If it's something where, as a faculty member, you'd want to go into doing your own kind of research study, so then headed in that kind of scholarship of teaching and learning direction. So there's resources there. That's another kind of sphere of this startup series now, is this sort of research investigation. So it's sort of training and doing education research. So as I said, our fellows generally come from a science research background, or in my case, math research, which involved zero work with data. And moving towards social science practices. What does it look like to ask questions? What does data look like? What are the kind of ethical issues around studying students in the classroom? So we also have that as a component if people were kind of interested that way. But in terms of classroom practices, there's How Learning Works, and then a few of our other resources. And then that's kind of the springboard, I guess, for all these other ideas.
Fantastic. I think we might have time for about one more question. Pym, do you want to take it, or should I take it?
Sure, I have one. You talked about how you can take a sometimes unpleasant experience like testing, make it a happier experience, and that was your two-stage tests. What other unpleasant experiences have you guys thought about, worked on, improved?
Sure. So I can say, the whole notion of making the classroom time more effective, I guess. So, nobody advocates for, showing up in class and droning on at the board for an hour and not taking any questions. This is sort of a caricature of poor lecture practice, which is just very rarely actually occurs. But in a kind of a large class, even someone who's trying, they're not necessarily getting a lot of participation from most students. Like, it's just very difficult to in a kind of a big class setting. So trying to make the classroom time more enjoyable, hopefully, for students, where they get to kind of work through problems with others in the class. So, and what do the activities look like typically? So we'll have sort of worksheets where it's maybe an old exam problem or some other kind of task that's sort of appropriate for them to practice with. Very commonly, we use clickers where it's in-class voting. So here we have the kind of simple 5-choice specific device voters. But you can use different kinds of devices or things to get students to vote. But the idea is get them to do some thinking, commit to their own answer, and then respond. And then the instructor can kind of follow up on that. But basically having, you want it to be more than just, oh, well, it keeps me awake. But that is a comment that we see from students. But it's, so you hope that it's more than that. And we found with surveys of students that they do value that sort of more effective classroom time, to feel like they're doing more. They're getting something out of it. So we found that even with people who don't offer participation points, for example, for clicker use. So students bring their clicker or not, it's sort of up to them. As long as that participation is useful to them, like as long as it feels like they're actually learning something, then they will participate in that activity, even though they aren't necessarily obligated to by grades. So we've seen some nice things there. And we found students are capable of distinguishing between kind of effective practice and sort of token, like getting people to vote to check attendance or something like that. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. Steve, you want to take, the last question?
Actually, what we usually do at this point is mention again that, well, first of all, thank you very much for joining us. And then mention that, as I said, we'll put up shout-outs of things that you've referred to, including the CWSEI website, the Science Education Initiative, and some info about two-stage exams and that sort of thing. And I've taken notes as we went along, so hopefully we've caught everything. But is there anything else in particular that you'd like to call our attention to, that you want our viewers to see in the links?
No, I think I'll probably point out some specific things from the website is one way. I mean, we have tried to build that as a resource for people that are teaching in a lot of ways. A lot of it's meant to be for them at various different, I guess, layers. So there's sort of the specific, like, explicit ideas around classroom practices, but there's also, here's, if you want to dig more into it, here's some research. Here's sort of where we got these principles from. We also have a collection of our own research that's been done at UBC as under the initiative. Pretty extensive set of different things. So there's some research on as I said, the two-stage exams and pre-reading and other kinds of interactive methods. So if you want to see evidence or what a study might look like if you were going to try to undertake things at your own institution, because people tend to really like having local evidence. We also have some instruments there for people to use. So if you kind of refer through there, so things for like measuring student attitudes around your discipline. We have some classroom observation protocols around kind of measuring like what's going on in the class, or classroom observation protocol for undergraduate STEM, which is trying to measure what are students doing, what are instructors doing over the course of a classroom period, and as one way to see what does this person's practice look like? Is there kind of interaction? Are the students actually spending time doing things? That sort of thing it's meant to capture. Protocol that's more around specific, like are students engaged? So trying to measure, like, do people kind of just go off track during class time or not? So there's these different kinds of tools as well. Yeah. So lots to look for there. And some background information on the initiative for people that are interested, but they're also welcome to contact me about that.
All right.
My email address, I guess.
We'll put that on there. All right, fantastic. Thank you for joining us, Warren.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks so much. It's been fun.
Thank you.